Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I have amazing news because today we conquered technical difficulties, and I am very pleased and honored to welcome Professor Samuel Levine, the author of the amazing book Was Yosef on the Spectrum. And I cannot wait to hear from him. Without further ado, let me bring Professor Levine to the stream and let's go. Hello, Professor. Thank you so
Hello.
much for accepting my invitation and bearing with me to go through all those technical obstacles last week. But I am really pleased to have you here, and let's dive right in. Could you say a few words about you, your background? Because your biography is so long. I was just stumbling through my words last week trying to tell our audience everything about you. It's just fascinating.
Okay, thank you, and good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for having me on your show. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to participate in the important work that you are doing and promoting and sharing
Thank you.
with everyone. So briefly about myself personally, I'm a law professor. I teach at Touro Law Center, Touro, in New York and Long Island. My background is in both rabbinic studies and law, and that's what got me interested in many ways in the topic of Joseph on the spectrum. I got my JD at Fordham Law School in New York. I got an LLM, a master's in law, post law school degree, an advanced degree at Columbia Law School in New York. And I got my rabbinic ordination at Yeshiva University. And I was actually studying both rabbinic law and American law at the same time. I would study rabbinic law at Yeshiva University in my advanced rabbinic studies, and sometimes the very same day engage in the study of American law, whether it was at Fordham or at Columbia. And it occurred to me that there are many areas of comparison and contrast and insights that we can draw from one system to another. And I think it's part of that analytical process and comparative process that drew me to my study of the story of Joseph. So fast forward to, or actually go back in time a bit to my interest in Joseph. It really grows out of my lifetime interest in the Torah, in the
Yes.
Bible, and like many of your viewers, I'm certain, being familiar with the story of Joseph from a variety of sources and having always had questions and been a bit puzzled about some aspects of the story. And as I began to increase my interest and my study and my experience legally and beyond in terms of autism and disability rights more generally, that's where it hit me that there seems to be a connection. There seem to be similarities and deep similarities, important, significant areas where the story of Joseph can be understood through the lens of contemporary understandings of autism.
Right. Yes. So you mentioned that you are ordained rabbi. Did I get that right?
That's right.
That's wonderful. That's tremendous because not only you studied from the law perspective, and I'm sure the Jewish law, so you could see everything in the Bible, in the Torah as you were studying, but also from the rabbinic point of view. So actually, as a scripture scholar, so I am really fascinated to hear about your insight and which characteristics of Joseph stood out to you as you were studying his story in our Bible. It's I believe Genesis chapter 37, and in Torah and all those other rabbinic Jewish sources as well. They discussed all those things. So what characteristics of Joseph stood out to you as you were studying
Well, there are actually
that story?
so many. I'm glad you asked the question, and it would take much more than the time we have to go through. I mean, the book itself,
Right.
141 pages, I think, and lots of
Yes.
footnotes. And I intentionally included those footnotes and those sources, and the subtitle of the book itself, as it appears on
Yes.
the screen, includes not only what we might refer to as the Torah, the text of the Bible, Genesis chapters 37 and on, several chapters really till the end of the book of Genesis. But in addition, Midrash, as you noted, the oral interpretations, the teachings, the traditions that have spanned thousands of years and spanned nearly the entire globe. We have rabbinic authorities, rabbinic thinkers from medieval Spain, from contemporary Middle East, from parts of Russia, from Ukraine. They're relevant enough. And
Yes.
we see, and I noted throughout the book and in my studies, that there is a common strain that runs through many of these different sources, interestingly, over different parts of the world and spanning different times, where there's the recognition that Joseph is different. And that's clear from the biblical text itself, of course, but
Yes.
there's more to it, because how is he different? What is it about Joseph? And I'm not sure how familiar all your viewers are, but in a nutshell, in terms of the story of Joseph, and some people might have seen the Broadway play, you might have seen the DreamWorks animation, you might have
Right.
read novels, seen other types of depictions of the story. We have someone who, on a very basic level, struggles to maintain a social relationship with his peers, in this case his brothers, an adult figure, an authority figure, his father, who loves him, who wants the best for him, but is likewise challenged in trying to navigate and trying to mediate that relationship between Joseph and his peers. And yet, despite all the calamities, despite all of the struggles that he goes through, ultimately, and fast forward quite a bit in the story, ultimately Pharaoh, for those who are familiar, the king of Egypt, appoints Joseph to this position of authority, this position of power, and this position of success. And at the very start of the story, we see this type of social interaction that seems to repeat itself throughout the story, where Joseph tells his dreams to his brothers, and he has these ambitions. The dreams are thinly veiled.
Yes.
Dreams of himself rising to power, rising to success, and he has his own visions per se, his ambitions of what he can achieve. And his brothers, don't seem to not believe him in the first place. They seem to think that there's something about him that will prevent him from reaching these goals or these dreams. And B, his brothers are not interested in hearing about it.
Right.
The part that's perhaps the most puzzling. His brothers don't like him, and yet he tells them about these dreams. And even when they express their distaste in no uncertain terms, he goes back to them and says, guess what? I have more dreams. I have more to tell you.
Right.
And when you read the story, you're just wondering, you're scratching your head. What is it about Joseph? Doesn't he get it? And
Social
there's
cue.
the social cue. And that's, to me, it jumped out exactly right.
Yes.
And I was puzzled by that. And, biblical commentators have noted how unusual it seems that Joseph goes back to them again, not just the first time, but the second time. And without getting into all the weeds in terms of the biblical text and the nuances, it's clear that he's coming toward them enthusiastically. He wants to share this information with them. And light bulb went off, as you can anticipate. You've seen it in the book, but I think you can sense already, many of your viewers, if you're familiar with autism, if you're familiar, and without generalizing, I want to just make that point. There are a lot of caveats here. I appreciate the notion that if you've met one person on the autism spectrum, you've met one person.
That's right.
On the autism. Every person is different, but there are fairly common characteristics, and one of them is this need to share information, this compulsion, as it seems, to tell other people, which is wonderful in many ways.
Yeah.
But it's not always successful because the listener is not always open to receiving the information, and the autistic individual does not always communicate or convey the information in a way that appreciates the listener's point of view. And that's what's going on here. They don't want to hear it, and yet Joseph persists in telling them about it. And the biblical commentators, as you mentioned, and pointedly, specifically, in terms of the subtitle of the book, it's these classical Jewish sources. It's commentators from various times and various geographical areas who note that there's something about Joseph, and they use terminology that's obviously not going to incorporate words like autism or neurodiversity or the terms that we use. My understanding of human nature, you can see some of the
I'm showing a lot of annotations. You have a lot of great resources and quotes from those Jewish sources, which give this extra insight an extra argument for what you are noticing.
Thank you.
So
And
that's amazing.
I appreciate that you brought that up on the screen, because I thought it was important to emphasize
Yes.
in writing the book that
Mm-hmm.
I'm not imposing some sort of artificial current framework on the
Mm-hmm.
past. I'm not looking at a thousands-year-old text and saying, well, let's rewrite it. Let's impose our own understanding. I think if we read carefully and we're sensitive to what was going on in those days, to what was going on in ancient and medieval times when these commentators were writing their comments, and even to contemporary times, I think
Mm-hmm.
we see this common theme running through, where
Right.
commentators, they weren't using words like autism, but they described Joseph using terms that we're familiar with, that describe Joseph as dedicated to the truth.
Right. Yes,
And
absolutely. And another thing that stood out to me in your book was that you noticed Nahar, that he was very childish in his behavior, even though he had like an old soul, an old mind, very wise for his age, yet he was uh, this childish behavior and other things like tiptoeing. Um, I mean, can you elaborate on that? It's
exactly
fascinating to
right.
me.
And it's funny, he asked me for some examples. We're still at the very first couple of verses. This is runs
Right.
chapters through the end of the book of Genesis, and
Yes.
it's all there. I think if we
Mm-hmm.
read carefully and sensitively, it's really all there in those opening verses, previewing his life and giving us the backstory and the backdrop to understanding the remainder of the story. So, as you note, the text describes Joseph as Na'ar. It says
Mm-hmm.
he's 17 years old at the very opening of the story. He's 17 years old and he's Na'ar. Now, the word Na'ar in Hebrew, and here we will get more nuanced in the biblical language,
Mm-hmm.
typically refers to a younger individual, a lad of sorts, a child. And it's highly unusual. It seems inappropriate to use the term Na'ar for a 17-year-old, even
Right.
in our times, and certainly in ancient times, where 17-year-olds were, from what we understand, really
Adults.
considered to be adults. Exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
So the Midrash picks up on this. I'm certainly not the first to realize this. We're not the first to discuss this. The Midrash, spanning thousands of years ago, notes how
Mm-hmm.
unusual it is to use that term. And it suggests, well, he was na'ar in his behaviors. He engaged in conduct such as tending to his eyes, kind of
Mm-hmm.
curling his hair, the tiptoeing, which
Right.
again is a nuanced reading of the Midrash. It seems to me that these behaviors are quite consistent with the kind of self-stimulatory behavior that we often find among children on the autism spectrum, as well as adults on the autism spectrum, and behaviors that we might understand, that we might be willing to accommodate, more readily willing to accommodate for a young child. But
Mm-hmm.
if you see a 17-year-old acting that way, it's less likely that the viewer, and here's where the peers come into play. The text actually describes Joseph as Na'ar with his brothers. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where we often find that children on the autism spectrum are isolated, ostracized,
Mm-hmm.
bullied
Right.
tragically by their peers, because the peers often don't have that willingness to embrace, to accept. If they see someone different, it's all too common that children have that sense of, we don't want to be around you, we don't want
Mm-hmm.
you to hang out with us, and we're going to do whatever we can. And it ends up tragic in Joseph's story, and ends up all too often tragic in our contemporary times as well. At the
Mm-hmm.
same time, the verse describes Joseph and the love that Jacob has for him on the basis of ben zikunim,
Mm-hmm.
another interesting, unusual term that's used, that Joseph is kind of elder. It has some connection to an elder or older quality. There are some
Right.
who suggest, well, he was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons, so Jacob was older when he had Joseph, so maybe for that reason he loved Joseph. That's one explanation. There are challenges to that explanation or objections to that explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Another explanation is that he loved Joseph because Joseph himself seemed a bit older, a bit wiser beyond
Mm-hmm.
his years. And that's
Yes.
Jacob appreciated in him. Now, here's where I think the rabbinic tradition, the midrashic tradition, becomes very interesting in our contemporary understanding of autism.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are those who say, wait a second, how can it be both? On the one hand, he's kind of childish.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, he's advanced beyond his years. And to me, we understand that when it comes to autism, there is no contradiction.
That's right.
This is very common. These are
Yes.
kind of both sides of the same coin, two sides of the same coin, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
where you have an individual who can both act in ways their behaviors appear unusual, even childish or childlike to others, but that
Mm-hmm.
very same individual may have advanced cognitive abilities and specifically areas of skill in a particular area, or what we describe as sort of limited interests or skills. And
Yes.
when it comes to Joseph, he's got these skills because
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that his dreams were accurate, that his dreams will come true to fruition in the long arc of time. It'll take
Right.
many years, but he's right. It turns out that he was correct, that he was telling the truth, and the clash between Joseph and his brothers was a combination of factors, as we
Mm-hmm.
often see in contemporary times. Joseph missing those social cues, missing out on realizing that his brothers just don't want to hear it, and
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be to his own self detriment to persist. Even though he's right,
Yes.
it's not going to be worthwhile for him to persist in telling the brothers what happens to be correct factually, and at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, his brother's inability to accept him for who he is, to accommodate, to appreciate that maybe there is something to what this person's saying. Maybe the fact that he curls his hair or whatever he does,
Right.
maybe the
Mm-hmm.
fact that he speaks in a way that's different from us. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to him. Maybe he has something valuable to say. So it's that clash that, again, we see in contemporary times as well, that
Yes.
led to tragedy and near fatal tragedy in Joseph's time, and continues to lead tragically to very unfortunate circumstances in our times.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great point because we can say that Joseph was bullied by his brothers. They even sold him as a slave. They wanted him dead. And very often, our children on the spectrum are bullied by their peers, and that's a very common tragic reality these days. So I am so glad that we can go back to the old text in the Bible, in the Torah, and just see that there is nothing new under the sun, as King Solomon said. And let's. What about Jacob, Yaakov, Joseph's father, when he gave him this coat of many colors? Because I really love your perspective, your feedback on that in the book. You just gave me another aspect to look at it. As I read through Genesis 37, I cannot unsee it now. So can you please elaborate on that?
Thank you. And we're still at the outset, right? We're still in those
Yes,
very
I
early
know.
verses of chapter 37. And I think, again, I think much of it is right there in the text and in the
Mhm,
interpretations, where there's this coat, as you mentioned, that
mhm.
Jacob gives to Joseph. He loves Joseph. He's trying to help him. He's trying to
Yes.
support him. He's trying to accommodate him. He's trying to do something to help his brothers, his peers, realize that there's something special, not special in terms of special needs, but
Right.
special in a
Yeah.
very positive way about this individual, about this peer of theirs, about this, not friend in this case, but their brother, about this classmate of theirs, as we'd say in contemporary times. So, what's a teacher to do? How does a teacher try to demonstrate the skills, the strength, whatever it is that this child has to contribute to the class, to the classmates, to the atmosphere? So Jacob, of course, gives Joseph, as is well known. It's described in the text as ketonet pasim, sometimes translated as a colorful coat, and of course, giving rise to the title of the Broadway play, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Well, the word pasim actually has a variety of interpretations and may very well indicate Jacob's attempt to try to appease, to try to comfort Joseph, to try to help Joseph fit in with his brothers.
Hmm.
He tries to achieve this by giving him a special coat with the hope that his brothers will catch on, his brothers will get it, his peers will realize, oh, well, if the authority figure is highlighting some of the skills, something special in a good way about this individual, maybe we should appreciate that as well. Now, of course, Jacob's attempts backfire. And,
Yes.
hindsight is 2020. It's easy for us to look and say, oh, come on, didn't you realize that if they don't like Joseph, if you give him something special, they're just going to be even more jealous. They're going to be even more
Right.
upset and hate him more. And I think we have to be fair and put ourselves in Jacob's position. And it's easy for us to say, well, we would do better. But, I know parenting is never easy. Parenting children who are different from each other is even more challenging.
Absolutely.
And we look at the way teachers in our society, with all of the advances we have, all the advantages we have, are still making very similar mistakes,
Right.
miscalculations, where a teacher will take a child who's on the autism spectrum, who's in the classroom. And again, these are stereotypes, but they're not uncommon. Let's say a child in the spectrum to be skilled at math. Okay, they're good at that. Yeah, I want to emphasize this is not intended as pigeonholing or stereotyping, but
Right.
let's take the example of a
Right.
child who's autistic and they're good at math. So a teacher may want to demonstrate that skill to the rest of the class. The child's having social issues, the class isn't appreciating the child. So how do we integrate them? How do we get the rest of the classmates to realize that this child has something to offer? So teachers sometimes will say, well, here's a tough question, and point to that child and single out that child. Or even worse, might say, oh, you know what? There's another child who's having trouble with math. And this is, let's say, a popular student. So how about the two of you get together with the hope, right? And we
Yes.
see where that's going to happen. And what turns out is that example is likewise played out in many ways in the story of Joseph and Jacob's reaction, because as the story proceeds, Joseph's brothers clearly don't want to have anything to do with him. They go off tending sheep somewhere.
Right.
Well, Joseph has another skill. So it seems from the language in the text. And once again, this is not us imposing our understanding on the text. The biblical commentators, well before there was this notion of autism, the contemporary notion of autism, the biblical commentators note that the language in the text, still in those first verses, describes Joseph as being particularly adept at shepherding. He's
Yes.
good with animals. And here too, as we know in contemporary times, and I believe this is something that was intuitively felt based on observation throughout the ages, that's not uncommon for autistic children and adults to have a certain skill connection toward animals. Perhaps the most famous autistic person in the world, Temple Grandin, developed remarkable inventions, and to this day is an advocate, and to this day helps organizations understand, and farmers and others understand how best to treat animals. So there is this connection, as we know. Well, Joseph seemed to be really good with animals. So here's Jacob's thinking, and we get it. We can understand where he was going with this. He realizes Joseph's brothers are off tending the sheep somewhere else. So he says to Joseph, oh, here's our chance. Why don't you go and see how they're doing?
Right.
And you can just imagine, and you're shaking your head because
Yes.
and again, we can kind of laugh, we can kind of say we know better, but we don't. Because these are struggles. How do you get children and adults to appreciate each other? How do you overcome the bias? How do you overcome the discrimination, the isolation, the bullying? So one strategy would be, well, let's demonstrate just how helpful this person can be. Let's demonstrate just how skilled. Let's build on those strengths, which is the right approach in many ways, but it has to be implemented properly. It has to be implemented with the buy-in, incorporating the surrounding structures. And in this case, when Joseph is left unattended, unsupervised with his brothers, rather than his brothers embracing him and saying, oh, great, we're having trouble with the sheep. Here's the person who's going to help us out. The reaction, of course, is the exact opposite. It's, oh, here comes that dreamer again. We don't want anything to do with him. And the scenario escalates on their part, as you described. They end up initially throwing him into a pit and ultimately selling him into slavery in Egypt. And this is where we have that challenge in our times as well. How do we demonstrate? How do we structure an environment? And it's that unsupervised time. And I use
Right.
the term unstructured time to relate not only to the schoolyard, not only to recess, where many autistic children have the challenge, where
Mm-hmm.
they're isolated, where they're kept apart, where they don't quite fit in. But as
Mm-hmm.
it turns out, when it comes to the employment setting as well, and before we came on air, we were just discussing my interest in
Yes.
autism and employment, and it's one of the areas
Mm-hmm.
of focus in my current work. Well, the workplace is really not that different. The unstructured setting of the workplace, where you have office politics, where you have gossiping
Yes.
and backbiting and all these social cues and expectations and unwritten rules, well, that's also a scenario where, if not properly designed, if the autistic individual is not properly appreciated and accommodated,
Mm-hmm.
then there's all too often the potential for failure.
Mm-hmm.
And when I use the term accommodation, I don't mean, again, sort of special treatment. That seems to be where Jacob went wrong,
Mm-hmm.
where he's looking for special treatment, giving a special coat
Mm-hmm.
to signal that Joseph's different. But that only makes the others more jealous. When I talk
Right.
about accommodations, I'm talking about a more universal form of understanding each individual
Mm-hmm.
and what they need to strive and to succeed.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of his brothers, they hated him because Jacob didn't really love passionately their mom, Leah, but he adored and really loved Rachel from the very beginning. And that's the woman he always wanted to marry. So they always resented that. And I believe in our days, we can compare that to um, the patchwork families or mixed families where children on the spectrum have a new stepmom or a stepdad, and they come with their children, and then those children usually resent someone because the parent of an autistic child speaks still kindly about the parent of this child, and then the new children with their new parent are like resenting him for that, which is not fair. So I just, when I read that and when you mentioned that, I just thought about those uh, families that are mixed families.
It's a very interesting point about the family dynamics and the
Hmm.
complexity, the added layer of complexity when we talk
Yes.
about autism and the family
Yes.
relationship. Absolutely.
And I just mentioned that because statistics are terrifying. I believe a few years ago it was 50% ending in divorce of the families with special needs child. And now I believe it's like 75%, which is really, really tragic and sad. So that's why I believe all those conflicts arise even more because of those broken
And I
family.
alluded, and I alluded briefly to the parenting challenges
Mhm.
that Jacob had, and it's interesting because when Joseph tells his dreams, he first tells his dreams to his brothers alone, his
Yes.
first set of dreams, which again are kind of thinly veiled
Hmm.
versions of him rising to power and actually
Right.
rising to power over them directly, which again comes to fruition. He was right,
Hmm.
as it turns out. The second time he tells his dreams, he tells them to his brothers as well as to his father Jacob, and his father, who loves him, gets upset at him.
Yeah.
And it's kind of surprising. On the one hand, Jacob loves him so much and gives him the coat, but yet he does demonstrate, he lets out this frustration. I think that might be the best way of translating or paraphrasing the biblical text, where Jacob's really frustrated at Joseph. And that's, again, part of that whole family dynamic that
Hmm.
comes out, and certainly can affect, in this case, as I think you mentioned, uh, Rachel had already passed away the years
Hmm.
before
Hmm.
these episodes. But if there's a spouse if the marriage is, if there's a marriage, um, certainly the parenting issues, studies have indicated, can go into some of that conflict.
Yes. Well, that's very interesting take on this aspect. And I would like to move forward to Egypt when Joseph is already in Egypt, and he's appointed to work at the palace, Pharaoh's palace, and then the whole hashtag Me Too moment and the whole history.
Well, here's what's just remarkable, and remarkable in the sense that, as you put it, as the Bible puts it, nothing new under the sun. Well, here we are. Joseph in Egypt is appreciated for his skills. There are those who can sense, who can realize and recognize the strength-based approach. Let's appoint Joseph to a job where he's going to do his job and going to do his job well. And here too, I can't resist, without pigeonholing, without overgeneralizing, I can't resist talking about some of the goals behind autism employment programs, and without having a formal program, hopefully more broadly recognition of the strengths that autistic individuals sometimes bring to a job, that loyalty, that willingness to comply with the task, with the job, with what they're supposed to do, the unlikeliness that they're going to take the 3-hour lunch, or that they're going to engage in office politics. And we sometimes view that as kind of a negative. Oh, they don't get along with others, but that's really our perception. You know, the same characteristic, it often can be considered a positive or a negative. If we say someone's a perfectionist, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's good if they're writing a legal brief. It's not a good thing if you're serving them dinner and they tell you they don't like the way you made the peas because they're overcooked. That's, you know, and the same thing is true when we talk about autism. We can say, well, someone has very narrow interests. Oh, someone is too dedicated to their own specific way of seeing things. But we can also say, this is great. We have an employee and they have a job and they're not interested in gossiping. They're not interested in wasting time at the water cooler. They want to do their job. And again, without stereotyping, this is the experience that we often find, that I've often studied in the context of autism and employment. Well, Joseph has this job and he's committed to the job. He's loyal to the job. And of all things, Potiphar's wife, his master's wife, propositions Joseph very directly and repeatedly. Now, Joseph is dedicated to his own personal morality that his father has taught him, dedicated to the job that he's supposed to do, and he refuses. He is, and I'll use another term that can kind of go both ways, sort of stubborn. Sometimes have this perception of an autistic individual as being stubborn, but why don't we flip that around and understand stubbornness not as a negative, but understand stubbornness as dedication, stubbornness as refusing to give into temptations, frustrations, in this case, the propositions, as you said, you know, a Me Too movement, you know, thousands of years before the Me Too movement, his supervisor is propositioning him. And he refuses day after day. And the language here is very indicative of his dedication and his persistence in doing that job, in following those rules, which we often find among individuals on the autism spectrum. He's going to continue, he's going to persist and persevere and ignore or refuse the advances of his master's wife for all the right reasons. Well, she is so manipulative, and this is where that Me Too really added us. She's so manipulative that she ends up A, attacking him, and B, blaming him. And in that position of power, she has the ability to manipulate the scenario so that we end up, or they end up, blaming the victim. And that's where all too often, whether it's in the schoolyard or whether it's in the workplace, all too often, or more generally, where an autistic person who's doing the right thing, it turns out they're the ones who were correct in their actions, but were not able to navigate the games the machinations, the manipulations of people
Mm-hmm.
around them. So we end up blaming the victim all too often. Here too, if it's a battle between this very clever and cunning wife
Yes.
of royalty
Mm-hmm.
versus this slave, this Hebrew
Mm-hmm.
slave, so we know who's going to win that battle. And Joseph
Mm-hmm.
ends up being imprisoned as a result.
Right. And Joseph, of course, was a very good-looking man, um, with very high moral values, following the law of his father, and he loved his God. He loved serving him, and everything was just to the dot. So, of course, because he was so good-looking, she made advances towards him, and like you said, he refused for many reasons. First of all, she was married to his boss. He was not interested. He was just there to do his job. And of course, that happened when there were no witnesses. There was no one else in the palace. So that was very convenient because there are no witnesses to say, yes, Joseph is right. She made a pass on him. And of course, who do you believe? Uh, of course, Potiphar's wife, who is highly positioned and such a wonderful person? Or do you believe this weird dreamer slave?
Exactly right.
So,
And this is another scenario where, looking from a distance, I sometimes consider if we put on a production, a play, a dramatic
mhm,
portrayal of the events here. And if
mhm,
we saw Joseph going to his brothers and telling the dream the second time, we'd be like, no,
mhm.
Joseph, don't. You're in the audience. You're like, no,
Yes.
don't. So here too, you're kind of saying to yourself, oh, come on, Joseph, don't go. And as you mentioned, there's no one else
Yes.
there. And
Yes.
the question is, why is there no one else there? And the biblical commentators
Mhm.
pick up on this and make the point that it was Potiphar's wife who manipulated, manufactured the situation. This was maybe a
Yes.
day, it was a holiday. Everyone was off. It
Yes.
was,
Mhm.
Thanksgiving, they all went to the parade.
Yeah.
So no one was around in the workplace. But
Mhm.
she told Joseph, you have to come in today. And of course,
Mhm.
Joseph says yes, not
Mhm.
knowing that no one else is going to be there.
Mhm.
And he goes into the inner room and then she has him trapped, per se. And as you mentioned, with no other witnesses. But
Mhm.
Joseph was unaware slash uninterested, and sort of that
Mhm.
combination for autistic individuals who kind of put out of their mind or don't quite appreciate, however you'd like to frame it,
Mhm.
don't quite see the danger because of that dedication, because of that
Yes.
devotion. He's going to do that job. And even if
Mhm.
we in the audience are looking and saying, come on, watch out, look behind, he doesn't see it.
Yeah.
And the reason he doesn't see it is, once again, it's that sort of paradox of a strength that's also a weakness, those two sides of the same
Mhm.
coin. The reason he doesn't see it is he's not thinking that way. He's thinking, this is my job. It's Thanksgiving. My boss told me, you got to be at work today. I'm
Mhm.
going into work. I'm not going to think twice about it. Some of us might think, wait a second, that's kind of odd. And this is
Mhm.
someone who has been making advances at me before. I better watch out. But Joseph's
Mhm.
not thinking along those lines, and he really walks right into her trap.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then we know he's being arrested and put to prison. And then he's in prison together with the wine bearer or butler and the baker. Then they have the dreams, and Jacob interprets those dreams.
Right, and I use the
Not all
term
of them are happy about those interpretations.
right. So I use the term butler and baker just because those are
Uh-huh.
common terms
Right.
we all know from nursery rhymes. That's an easy
Yes.
way to describe them. But yes, it's sort of the
Yes.
wine bearer, the royal baker, the person in
Yes.
charge, and they're in prison as well. And it's interesting that they're in prison. You kind of wonder, what have they done? We know what Joseph
Mm-hmm.
has done or not done, what he's been accused
Mm-hmm.
of doing. What did they do to be in prison? And there's a backstory here as well. The Midrashic commentators suggest that they committed relatively minor
Mm-hmm.
offenses, breaches of the royal protocol. Apparently, the baker allowed some pebbles to go into Pharaoh's bread, and
Yes.
that's a capital offense, or nearly in ancient Egypt, I guess. You have the king of Egypt looking over you and such control. And the butler apparently allowed a fly to go into the wine. Again, inexcusable, so they're both imprisoned. They both have these dreams, as you mentioned. And here is Joseph's opportunity to shine. Here is Joseph's opportunity to demonstrate his skills, because he's really good at dreams. He's
Yes.
good at having dreams that are going to be accurate, and he's good at interpreting dreams. This is one of his special skills. So he goes ahead and interprets the dreams for both of them. As you mentioned, he interprets the dream to the butler as being a very positive dream. They're similar dreams, as you mentioned, but
Yes.
differences. So Joseph can recognize the differences and tells the butler, you know what's going to happen in 3 days, you're going to be returned to your position of power. So the baker thinks, great, how about my dream? It seems pretty similar, right? And
Yeah.
Joseph says, well, in 3 days, you're going to be executed. And
Wow.
you can just imagine the baker's face, just fall,
Yes.
and he can't believe it. But Joseph doesn't seem to recognize the calamity that this would bring about for the baker, just how dejected the baker would be to hear this. As far as Joseph's concerned, he describes the interpretations in a fairly straightforward way, without distinguishing the two, other than the substance of between the two interpretations. So Joseph, again, is dedicated to the truth. He's going to tell it like it is. He's going to tell the butler the good news. He's going to tell the baker the bad news. And that's just the way things are. And they both realize he's got it right. There's something about Joseph that people recognize. When he's right, he's right.
Yes.
And for that reason, particularly when he interprets dreams, everyone has a sense, the people who hear him, in this case, each the butler and the baker, realize that both for their own dream and for each other's dreams, Joseph's got it right. Now, although, once again, Joseph speaks the truth and is dedicated to the truth and has this kind of connection to morality, as you mentioned before, to loyalty, which is very common among individuals on the autism spectrum, Joseph doesn't always communicate that truth in a way that's well received by the listener, in a way that's appreciated by those around him. So in this case, when he tells even the butler about the good news that he's going to be returned to the good graces of Pharaoh, he kind of overdoes it. And we have another instance of Joseph, as in telling his dreams to his brothers, of kind of saying too much, of going on and on when the listener might not want to hear it. And he actually makes a demand, essentially, to the butler. He says, here's what you do. When you go back to Pharaoh, tell him about me. And tell him I'm really innocent. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just a Hebrew. I was a slave, and I'm here. And think about what Joseph's saying from the butler's perspective. Let me get this straight. You want me to tell Pharaoh that this Hebrew slave who's in prison with me was actually falsely accused by this very noble, as you said, wonderful wife of Pharaoh's trusted advisor? That's not happening. That's the last thing I'm ever going to tell Pharaoh. So to me, putting ourselves in the butler's perspective in this situation, the butler's thinking, on the one hand, this is great. Thank you for your interpretation. That's great news. On the other hand, I'm a bit wary about what you're demanding of me. He doesn't say this, but thinking from his perspective, he's probably a bit wary, because do I really say anything to Pharaoh about you? Or do I just take my good fortune and move on and forget about you? And what happens is he actually does forget about Joseph. And commentators wonder, come on, how can you forget? Don't you have some appreciation for this person? And in my reading, I suggest that it's not that he merely forgets about what happened. He's not really going to forget. This was big news. This was a big event in his life. It's more than that. And there's actually the active language here. Another nuance in the text, it says that the butler didn't remember Joseph and he forgot him. Biblical commentators note that there's sort of an active form of forgetting. He's putting Joseph out of his mind. He's trying his best. Because he understands, he recognizes that there's some nuance here and there's some potential danger. On the one hand, he recognizes that he kind of owes Joseph one, so to speak. And he recognizes that this is a very skilled individual. And maybe it will be worthwhile to mention him to Pharaoh at some point. But on the other hand, maybe he just wants to leave well enough alone.
Yeah.
maybe based on the way he spoke to him, the butler's thinking, well, great, that was a nice moment, but I'm not going any further with this person because they're just too different. They're just too
Mm-hmm.
unusual. The way they speak
Mm-hmm.
is not going to be appreciated. And now it's important to recall that Midrashic teaching. If it's the case that the butler and the baker have been imprisoned because
Mm-hmm.
of all things, there was a fly in the wine, there were pebbles in the bread, very
Right.
minor breaches of royal protocol,
Mm-hmm.
the butler may be thinking, if this Joseph ever appears before the king, there's
Mm-hmm.
no telling how he's going to act, how he's
Right.
going to behave,
Yes.
what he's going to
Mm-hmm.
say. And if I bring someone before the king and he says the wrong thing, well, then it's off with both of our heads, right? I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to get
Mm-hmm.
blamed for the fact, who is this person that you're bringing before me? I can't believe the way they're talking to me. I gave you another chance, and this is
Yes.
how you take advantage of it. So that's
Mm-hmm.
my reading of that episode.
Well, that's fascinating because I never really put myself in the baker's shoes. And you're absolutely right that someone would be like, oh my goodness, I've spent some time with this person. Yes, I love the interpretation of my dream. And fingers crossed, I will be returning to the palace and I will get my job back. But he's asking me to basically say that whatever his accuser said was a lie. And my goodness, yes, that's a great, great point. I never really paid attention to the perspective of Baker, how he must have felt when Joseph demanded that he goes and tells Pharaoh once he gets restored. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
We have a question from my husband who says, are there any other figures in the Bible that have similar characteristic as Joseph?
That's a great question. And I'm glad you asked it for a couple of reasons. It's a great question in and of itself. It also gives me the opportunity to mention, which I like to do, and I describe kind of my thinking in writing the book and appreciating the story and the similarities between Joseph and
Mm-hmm.
contemporary understandings of autism. My goal was not to sort of look at biblical figures and see who fits
Right.
autism or ADHD. It was, I'm reading the story of Joseph and trying to understand it theologically, religiously, intellectually, to understand what's going on. And that was what jumped out at me in terms of Joseph. So I haven't really had the opportunity to look at other biblical figures in that
Mm-hmm.
context. It wouldn't surprise me. And one of the basic premises behind this study and our discussion is, I think, the recognition, as you've said a couple of times, there's nothing new under the
Yes.
sun, the recognition that human nature changes within context, but doesn't fundamentally change.
Mm-hmm.
And we have autistic individuals today, we have ADHD today, we have depression today. We look back in the
Absolutely.
Bible, and I think a sensitive, close reading of both the text and interpretations just jumps out at you that we had similar characteristics, similar circumstances. We read Shakespeare, right, from
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of years ago, and we can relate to the characters. Well, the same thing is
Mm-hmm.
true about the Bible. And from a theological, religious perspective, certainly the Jewish tradition is to draw those lessons. The Jewish
Mm-hmm.
tradition is to see the Torah, to see the Bible not as a one-time book, but as a book with a living lesson for all time.
Absolutely. I agree. Uh, you also wrote a blog post, I believe it was on LinkedIn, and you had a point lessons that the story of Joseph has to offer in regards to autism. And I believe it was a great summary, also referring to your book. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, thank you, and perfect timing in terms of, I think, where we are in the story, because I wouldn't want to leave out, sort of the good news for Joseph,
Yes.
which is that even though the butler decides to forget Joseph, there's no
Mm-hmm.
going back, because as it turns out, the very next episode in the story describes Pharaoh having these dreams.
Right.
And we can just see this coming now, right? Again, we're
Mm-hmm.
in the audience, we're like, whoa, dreams again, there's got to be a place for Joseph here.
Yeah.
But the question is, how do we get there? And
Mm-hmm.
with all the challenges that we've seen, with all the reluctance of the butler to
Mm-hmm.
mention Joseph, well, is Pharaoh ever going to find out that there is this Hebrew slave sitting in prison who somehow has the key to his dreams? And Pharaoh has these very strange dreams.
Yes.
He's disturbed by them. He calls everyone he can think of. He has it seems that there are sorcerers of sorts, magicians, wise people in the palace, in the entire kingdom, the Egyptian empire. No one can figure it out. So at this point, the butler, and again, putting ourselves in
Yes.
his place and trying to understand his perspective. Now, what do I do? Well, on the
Yes.
one hand, I don't know. I'm just nervous about bringing in front of the king because I saw the way he acts and the way he talks, but he's really the person for the job.
Right.
And I think this is where the contemporary employment context really comes into play, and one of the lessons we can draw. Because as it turns out, the butler does remember Joseph at this point, and he's willing to recommend Joseph in his own self-interest. Let's say he wants to take credit. He's thinking, well, I've got the person. Now, let's say your boss calls out to everyone in the workplace. In this situation, it was everyone in the kingdom, but calls out, has a meeting, and says, okay, we need someone who can do job X. And you're sitting there. You know someone that can do that job. And they can't find anyone else. They've posted online. They've searched wide and far. They've interviewed people. No one can do it. You have the person who you know has the skills, the ability to do that job. But you've hung out with this person. You've been there. You've had conversations. And as is tragically often the case with autistic individuals, people who are at work, friends of theirs, people who care for them, are sometimes reluctant to recommend them for a job because they're concerned about that social aspect. And if the person doesn't fit in, if the potential employee doesn't quote unquote fit in the workplace culture and atmosphere, words that are often used to really mask discrimination, then that's going to reflect poorly on the person who recommends them. So here's what the butler does. Of all things, he recommends Joseph. He says, I've got someone for you.
Yeah.
But he describes him using pejorative terms, including that same word, na'ar. And we've seen this before. The word na'ar was used as a way of signaling to us in the early part of the story that although Joseph is cognitively advanced in many ways, ben zikunim, wise beyond his years, he does demonstrate behaviors, he does act in a way that is sometimes shunned by others, sometimes seen by others as being socially unacceptable. So here's what the butler does. He says to Pharaoh, well, I've got someone for you, but of all things, he recommends him in pejorative terms. He calls him an Ar, he calls him a Hebrew, which is in fact a racially charged term in biblical times, a discriminatory term within the Egyptian empire, those Hebrews. So on the one hand, he's recommending Joseph as being able to do the job and to do the job very well, but he's also signaling to Pharaoh, watch out, be ready, because when I bring this person before you, when you have that interview, they may say some things that might catch you off guard, that might seem a little unusual. They may act in a way that
a little disclaimer
there, covering just in case, don't blame me. I want to take the credit, but I don't want to be blamed. So Pharaoh's response of all things is not, well, I don't want someone like that. They want to fit our culture. Are you kidding? A Hebrew is going to help me in the royal kingdom and all that? His response is just the opposite. Go get him. Rush him to me. I want the person who can do the job. So Joseph's brought before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh starts off, this is the interview in contemporary terms. It's very much on point for lessons we should learn for autism employment, where it's the interview process that's often the barrier when it comes to autism employment. And once again, without ascribing blame necessary, without ascribing judgment, the reality is that our interview process is typically not set up to determine whether the candidate can do the job. It's kind of a funny thing about our interview process. We don't ask a candidate to demonstrate their ability to do the job. We rely on the resume, we rely on references, we rely on their background. The interview is really more of a game. It's more of acting out in a way that can find favor in the eyes of the boss. And
That's
that's
right.
what it is. And the
Mhm.
ultimate, example of this is that famous question toward the end of the interview where the interviewer says, okay, do you have any weaknesses? Right. And
Yes.
we all know what you should say. You should say,
Hmm.
oh, my weakness is, as we said before, I'm a perfectionist.
Yes.
Oh, my weakness is I'll do the job to the very end. I'll do overtime. I'll do someone else's job. I can't help it. Right.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
obviously you don't mean that as a weakness. You mean that as one more way of promoting yourself.
Right. Hmm.
And what we hear so often among autistic individuals is
Hmm.
that in the interview, they don't want to play those games. It's that dedication to the truth. It's that
Hmm.
distaste for these social games and the willingness or insistence on
Hmm.
telling it like it is. So if the interviewee, if the candidate says, oh, my weakness is it takes me some time to process things.
Hmm.
So the interviewer is going to
Yes.
think, wait a second, that's the last person I'm going to
Yes.
hire. Well, guess what? It takes a lot of people time to
Hmm.
process things, but they don't tell you that. And
Exactly.
they're certainly not going to tell you that they're rude or they're nasty or they
Hmm.
will undermine the other employees. They're
Hmm.
not going to talk about that. So the reality is that the interview is really not designed. It's a funny, strange
Hmm.
aspect of our whole process is that the interview is not really designed to get to the important question of whether this individual can do the job. So
Right.
Pharaoh starts off the conversation with Joseph along the lines that we'd expect. He says, so Joseph, I hear that you're good at interpreting dreams, right? Making small talk.
Hmm.
Um,
Yes. And
Joseph
here
doesn't
comes Joseph.
hold it, and Joseph responds. And interestingly, here again, the nuanced text, the Torah uses the word vaya'an. He answered Pharaoh, and answering is usually describing some sort of contention, some sort of
Mm.
correction. And
Hmm.
he corrects Pharaoh. He says, no,
Oh my.
not me. God's going to interpret your dreams.
There you go.
And just imagine it. And just imagine, I'm not sure if the butler was present for this part of the conversation.
Yes. Oh, stop.
I told you, I warned
Yes.
you. And he's thinking, oh no, it's all going down from here. And I should
Hmm.
never have mentioned just, but Pharaoh's response is, here's my dream. He
Hmm.
doesn't skip a beat. And he realizes, you know what? Let's just put all that aside. I don't care about small talk. I don't care about whether it's you or your God or who cares.
Hmm.
Whatever the skill is, here's my dream. Let's see if you can do it.
Yes.
And he goes into the dream and Joseph interprets it. And when Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream, it's just clear to everyone there,
Hmm.
including Pharaoh's servants, who you can tell are upset at Joseph. They don't. And the cover of my book that you
Hmm. Yes.
before is taken from an old etching, actually a wood
Yes.
carving. And
Yes.
one of the reasons I like this depiction is you can kind of see, and we can imagine
Yes.
Pharaoh sitting there kind of skeptical,
Yes.
wondering, let's see what this
Absolutely.
person has to offer. And you can,
Yes.
I appreciate the way the artist
Yes.
shows the servants, shows
Yes.
trusted advisors. They don't know what to make of this person either. They don't know what to make of
Right.
Joseph. And they're very skeptical and they're jealous also
Hmm.
because as he continues to talk, they realize that he's right. And
Hmm.
they resent the fact that none of them could figure it out
Right.
and that he comes up with the correct answer. Now, one more, I think, very important point for contemporary lessons and contemporary efforts to promote autism employment. It's interesting to wonder, why is it that Joseph got it right and no one else did?
Hmm.
So possibly Joseph just has that way of thinking. He has that skill when it comes to dreams beyond the abilities of anyone else. But it's also worth thinking about the substance of what Joseph tells Pharaoh. Because Joseph tells
Hmm.
Pharaoh, and this is the dream with the fat cows and
Yes.
the skinny cows swallow the fat cows and they're skinny again. So Joseph recognizes that the dreams mean that there's going to be both feast and famine, and that
Hmm.
Pharaoh has to be prepared for famine. Now,
Hmm.
that's bad news for Pharaoh.
Right.
So let's go back to our contemporary interview setting. The
Hmm.
boss calls the candidate in and says, so, I hear you're pretty good at accounting.
Hmm.
We need a good accountant. I hear you're pretty good at computer coding. And here's our code. What do you think? And the candidate looks and says, you know what? I've studied your books. I've studied your business model, and
Mm-hmm.
you're going nowhere. In fact, you're up for some really bad news. I think next quarter is going to be a real loss for you. So the boss can take one of two approaches.
Mm-hmm.
Their attitude can be, I'm not hiring you. Get out of here. I'm going to throw you out. And Pharaoh could have said to Joseph,
Mm-hmm.
you're telling me, the king of the Egyptian empire, that
Mm-hmm.
we're in for bad news, that we're going to have a famine, that I better be ready for what's
Mm-hmm.
coming? How
Mm-hmm.
dare you say that to me, you Hebrew slave, you Na'ar, you're out of here, and
Right.
off with your heads. He actually takes the opposite approach. He says,
Mm-hmm.
really? So tell me what to do. And
Mm-hmm.
Joseph tells him what to do. And to me, that's a preferable approach for the
Absolutely.
boss to take. The boss's response should not be, how dare you come into my company?
Mm-hmm.
I have this Fortune 500 company, and you're telling me that our business model doesn't work?
Mm-hmm.
The response should be, well, tell me a bit more. Why
Yeah.
is it that you think we're in for a bad quarter? And that's exactly the person that you want to hire. That's
Mm-hmm.
exactly the person that you need on your team. And it could
Mm-hmm.
be that the other advisors, maybe they had an inkling of what the dreams meant. Maybe Pharaoh himself
Yeah.
had a sense that, this strange scenario of these cows, the skinny cows, and maybe it meant that there was bad news, but no one wanted to break the bad news to Pharaoh. Well,
Yes.
autistic individuals are often willing or dedicated to that notion of this is the way it is, and I'm going to tell it the way it is. Whether you like it or not, I'm going to tell you the truth.
Yes.
And when
And there is
that's
a
appreciated,
question.
okay.
Yes, pardon me. It's the question, but I believe that you are already answering this question. What are the biggest takeaways or lessons that modern society could learn from the innocent but bold honesty of Joseph? So that's exactly what
Right,
we're
exactly
discussing.
my point. Thank you for that question, and exactly right. And your point about society, I am very involved in autism and employment, so that's
Mhm.
very much on my mind. And I think the engagement between Pharaoh and Joseph speaks very much to our contemporary interview process. But your question is well taken more broadly. I think
Mhm.
society more generally, it's incumbent on society to recognize the value, to recognize the strengths, to recognize that there is a place and time for diplomacy.
Mhm.
And there's also a time and place to tell it like it is. And
Right.
sometimes it doesn't always feel good. None of us wants to be criticized. None of us wants to hear the uncomfortable truths, but we actually benefit more from that bold honesty, as you described it.
Mhm.
And you make the point that sort of innocent honesty.
Mhm.
Pharaoh recognizes, to his credit, and I certainly wouldn't want to glamorize Pharaoh. I don't
Mhm.
think he's doing this for any good reasons. I think he's committed to no one but himself. He wants
Right.
to maintain
Mhm.
power. He wants the business to grow, but you know what? We'll kind of take that as well. We'll accept for now, at least, that a boss will hire autistic individuals in their own best interest, not because they want to
Yes.
help someone else out, but they want their business to do well, and they'll hire good and loyal employees. And likewise, we should all appreciate that when someone tells you something that's helpful, that's beneficial to you, and particularly when they're doing it not because they want to insult you, not because
Mhm.
they want to put you down. Joseph's not trying to insult or criticize Pharaoh.
Mhm.
Joseph's not trying to insult his brothers. He's telling it like it is.
Right.
And rather than resenting him, and we as a society, rather than resenting that type of bold honesty, we
Mhm.
should accept and embrace it.
Absolutely. That sums it up for me. And you're absolutely right. There are so many wonderful, gifted, maybe socially awkward individuals on the spectrum with tremendous skills that can benefit any company, depending on their skills, of course. But they are so focused, especially if it's their passion, if they're fixated on, let's say, math or numbers, or they're good about coding or any creating software. In Israel, for example, there is a lot of individual on the autism spectrum with Asperger's syndrome working at the defense ministry, and they are just irreplaceable. They are so focused on their task and details, and they see outside of the box. They can see solutions where everyone else is just focused on small thing, and they cannot just come up with anything else. That's where they come up with inventions and things that are beneficial for society.
And maybe that's what Joseph accomplished with the dreams. Maybe everyone
Hmm.
else was looking at, as you said, those kind of small details. They were
Hmm.
just too distracted by the strangeness of the story. But he was willing to look at the big picture and the dreams that the butler and the baker had. But likewise, very odd dreams about a bird,
Hmm.
about different things that were going on, and the dreams that Pharaoh had, which maybe distracted or confused other people. And it was that ability to think out of the box
Hmm.
allow Joseph to interpret the dreams in a way that no one else could. And I appreciated the way you used the term, passion.
Hmm.
Because here too, whether it's a passion or a fixation, these are words that we use to try to
Hmm.
capture a very nuanced reality. And we don't have the language that can
Hmm.
describe someone's inner workings, that can describe someone's neurotype, the way they think. So we use these terms to try to get somewhere, to try to gain some appreciation and understanding. And that's where turning to the biblical text as depicted, turning to the interpretations where different very wise individuals over the years use their own language. And it
Hmm.
may have been 14th century Hebrew, rabbinic Hebrew,
Hmm.
but they were also getting to the same point where we are. And we're still
Yes.
using various terms, whether we refer to neurodiversity or autism or the autism
Hmm.
spectrum or the word Asperger's you used before. And language is always evolving. And there are some people who appreciate these terms. Some people don't like some of these terms for all kinds of reasons.
Hmm.
But we're really getting at is trying to understand the human condition. And that really doesn't change over time. And I think it's appropriate and helpful for us to look back at the wisdom from over the years to better understand our times as well.
Hmm. And like I Care for Autism, the organization I cooperate with, they had the seminar or the conference about employment of people with special abilities, not disabilities, but special abilities, because we cannot look at autism or the spectrum as disability, because it's very often, like you pointed out, it's special ability, specific focus on one thing. I mean, they can be geniuses in one thing and are in their social interactions or tasks that they don't really care about. They can be just oblivious and behaving more childish about those topics. But when it's something that they are passionate about, when they are educated about, and just their life revolves around the specific topic or area of interest, they are just masters.
I think that's the lesson, that one of the many many lessons that jumps out at us from the story
Mhm.
of Joseph.
Let's fast forward now. Joseph interprets the dream. It comes true, and Pharaoh promotes him to be his right hand man and in charge of all the supplies of Egypt. And then there is famine. Hebrews are suffering. There is starvation, and his brothers are sent to Egypt to speak to beg for some food to for mercy.
So of all things, Joseph's brothers are in the land of Canaan, in the land of modern Israel, and they have to go to Egypt because Egypt's the place where, thanks to Joseph. And
Hmm.
by the way Joseph got promoted to this position through some self promotion of a sorts.
Hmm.
In that interview with Pharaoh, as we're calling it, that interaction with Pharaoh, Joseph went on and on with his plan, with his devising this
Hmm.
strategy to overcome, to both recognize and to overcome the impending famine.
Hmm.
And it's noted by a lot of the biblical commentators that's a bit much for someone who's interviewing. Let's say the position is okay, we have an open position for someone on one of the lower levels of the employment rungs. You're going to be a coder, let's say. or you're going to be an accountant, and within the interview, the candidate says, well, you really need someone to be your vice president. You really need someone to be your COO. You
Right.
need someone who's going to run everything.
Yes.
And it's got to be someone who has skills A, B, and C. And what do you know? That happens to fit my resume. Joseph goes through all that. But you know what? Again, it doesn't faze Pharaoh, because Pharaoh doesn't mind, of all things, the fact that Joseph is speaking out of turn, because Pharaoh recognizes that what Joseph's saying makes total sense. So, as you
Yes.
noted, Pharaoh does appoint Joseph to be the one to administer this entire scenario that he's described. Who better than the one who designed the scenario to actually have to administer it? But, and it's worth noting, that Pharaoh, and here too, without glamorizing Pharaoh, Pharaoh actually seems to provide the structures, the settings, the supports that were missing from Jacob's plan. Again, Jacob
Right.
loves Joseph, wants to help him, offers him supports, but the brothers resent those supports,
Yes.
what they see as favoritism on the part of Jacob. When it comes to Pharaoh, he provides Joseph with nice clothes, with a name, a kind of very profound name, and he provides him, as it's described, with a wife who's herself of royalty. And it seems to me, and commentators mention, that Pharaoh recognizes a lot about Joseph. Pharaoh's dealt with a lot of people. He's ruling over Egypt. He can take the measure of a person through that conversation. And it's not news to him that there are individuals like Joseph who maybe will have social challenges and at the same time be very skilled and very productive and very useful in Pharaoh's own self-interest. So Pharaoh's thinking, wait a second, I know how this all works. I'm the master politician, and I know the political world. I know the royal intrigue. I know how to watch out for people, and someone needs to watch out for Joseph. If I provide him a wife who's of royalty, well, she'll handle all of the royal intrigue. She'll handle all the politics. And through those supports, we call them in contemporary times, accommodations, those structures that will allow Joseph to do his job, and to do his job in the way that we know he's able to. And he won't have to worry about backbiting and people in the office or in the palace, for that matter, undermining him, looking to get him. And therefore, Joseph does have the ability and rises to that viceroy position, as it's sometimes described, kind of second in command, to specifically for the purposes of administering this food distribution. Now, the brothers have to go to Egypt to get food. And of course, who are they going to find there? Unbeknownst to them, and they can't imagine, actually, that's going to be Joseph, who's the one who's administering the food distribution. But what's different about Joseph in his interactions with his brothers is not only that, well, this is years later, but the way he comports himself. And I think when Pharaoh gave Joseph that position of power, the new name, that kind of new identity, I use the term persona in the book, and this can have negative connotations and even negative ramifications in contemporary times. We sometimes talk about masking. One of the tragedies of a lack of understanding or appreciation of autistic individuals is that tendency to mask, to not be yourself. Well, Joseph sort of navigates this tension where he recognizes that he does have to take on a different personality if he's going to be in charge. And it's a more assertive, more confident, and more socially aware personality. And that's where his brothers cannot imagine not only that the child that they sold into slavery all these years ago is now second in command in Egypt, but they couldn't imagine that the person who speaks to them with such authority and with such precision and with such awareness, they can't imagine that that's really Joseph. But my reading, the reason Joseph is able not so much to mask, but to take on that position of authority is because he's now in that realm of demonstrating and applying his passion, applying
Yes.
his skills. And it's within that realm that he is able to shine, to feel more confident, and he expresses himself in that different way. And it's not uncommon. If we ask autistic individuals, let's say, to give a speech or to be in a position to power, where the contours of their job and their role are very clear, they may thrive. They may be very successful. And that same individual, when they're kind of off stage, so to speak,
Yes.
remains the same person inside. And I think that's another lesson that we see from the story. What happens is eventually Joseph himself manufactures a scenario where his brothers will come to realize what they've done wrong. Not knowing it's Joseph, they will confess
Yes.
and demonstrate remorse for what
Yes.
they've done wrong. And of all things in my reading, and this takes a very close look at the interactions between both Joseph and his brothers, when they go to Joseph, and the brothers when they go back to Jacob,
father.
they go back and forth, and they're describing what happened, and they're thrown for a loss. They don't understand why it is that when they keep speaking the truth, it ends up getting them in trouble. Now, why is that familiar to us? Because that was Joseph's life.
Yes.
With them. Joseph spoke the truth, and somehow everyone blamed him, accused him. They tell Joseph that one of their brothers is back in Egypt, and he says, "Oh, you must be spies." And they're like, "What? We just told you something true. Of all things, why are you taking that out on us? Why are you blaming us?" And in my reading, Joseph is working through a process with them. They are truly going to have to appreciate what they've done and appreciate what and how they were wrong in misjudging and failing to appreciate Joseph for who he is. And it's only when Judah approaches Joseph after a bunch of back and forth, a number of events that just seem very puzzling to them, and they keep doing the right thing from their perspective.
Yes.
They often say the wrong thing. They often get themselves in trouble. They often say that they talk about having sold Joseph when other people can hear them. They're being truthful, but they're being socially unaware of their surroundings. There's this episode where Joseph actually places their money back in their bags before they go back to Jacob. And they return back to Egypt for a second time. And they have this whole long story about, oh, don't blame us for the money. And who's blaming them? Who's saying anything about this? So they are so prone
Guilt.
to guilt and to speaking what's important to them, what they care about, what they're concerned about, without taking into account how that sounds to the listener. That same pattern that had been Joseph's experience before. Finally, what happens is Joseph has one more plan. He places his goblet in the bag of Benjamin to somehow incriminate Benjamin and all of them. And what happens now is Judah approaches Joseph and says, "Okay, let's just get this straight." And he gives this long, impassioned speech. The speech consists basically of retelling the entire story and expressing his own bewilderment. How can it be? We did A, which was okay, and you did B, which was accusatory. We said A, which was innocent, and you blamed us. We don't get what's going on. What happened here? And at that point, Joseph's willing to say, you know what? Now you get it. Now you understand that I was telling the truth. I wasn't criticizing you. I wasn't the spy. I wasn't stealing things from you. I was actually telling the truth, and it was really for your benefit all along. It was for all our benefits. But you did not appreciate me for who I was, and you blamed the victim. You made me the bad guy when I actually was innocent. Well, you know what? That's what's really going on here. You were innocent all along.
Basically, taste your own medicine.
Taste your own medicine and appreciation and a true expression of contrition. And it was once Judah, as the leader of the brothers, speaking for all the brothers, came
Mm-hmm.
before this person, still not knowing it's Joseph, came before this individual and said, here's what happened. Maybe we were right and maybe we were wrong. Our
Yeah.
intentions were good. What's going on? And at that point, Joseph just couldn't take it anymore. And that's, to me, once again, that's sort of masking of sorts, but more
Mm-hmm.
a sense of Joseph being exhausted by
Mm-hmm.
continuing in this job and in that position of
Mm-hmm.
employment and this figure, this persona. And then he returns
Yes.
to the real Joseph. So first he reveals to his brothers, I'm really Joseph,
Mm-hmm.
long lost brother. And then he quickly launches into this speech. And here we have Joseph,
Yes.
in some ways, becoming himself again. Because I think it's important to note that when we talk about autism, we are talking about a neurotype.
Mm-hmm.
And we may and we should, society should, schools should, employment settings should
Mm-hmm.
provide support structures, ways for someone to thrive who's autistic,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not changing the person.
Yes. IEP.
In IEP, exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, Pharaoh did provide the IEP, but which at the same time has to appreciate the person
Mm-hmm.
who they are. And Joseph is still Joseph. And
Yes.
Joseph is out of this persona of being at the second in command to Pharaoh. Now he's a brother again among his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
He speaks in a way that's kind, but he also speaks in a way that's kind of rambling, that gives too much information. He's back
Yes.
to being Joseph again. And now, as the story proceeds, his brothers can better appreciate Joseph. And
Mm-hmm.
there's something of a happy ending where
Mm-hmm.
Joseph does truly reconcile with his brothers
Yes.
after Jacob passes away. And here's the real
Mm-hmm.
challenge. Here's the test case, because now Pharaoh's not overlooking them. Jacob's not supervising them. This is that
Mm-hmm.
unstructured, unsupervised setting. And it's in that situation where Joseph and Joseph's brothers are still wondering, is he going to take it out on us? Is he
Mm-hmm.
now going to take revenge?
Yes.
Now
Now
that
that
we're
daddy's gone.
right, and as you
Mm-hmm.
said, the tables have turned, and now we're in this unstructured setting.
Yes.
But Joseph holds all the cards. He has all the
Right.
power. So is he going to take it out on us, take revenge? And he doesn't. Instead, he speaks to
Mm-hmm.
their hearts, and they truly
Yes.
reconcile.
Mm-hmm. You see the question, is it possible autistic individuals don't have a concept of revenge like neurotypical individuals?
That's a great question. I think that may very well be the case. And that's
Yes.
why the brothers thought that Joseph was going to take revenge. Now,
Mm-hmm.
it's very common, again, without generalizing, overgeneralizing, it's very common for autistic individuals to have a strong sense of justice.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
justice is different from revenge. And I like the way you put it. And this is a point, one of the courses I teach, in addition to my work in Jewish law and American law, my primary areas of research in American law are the
Mm-hmm.
criminal law and legal ethics. And when I talk to my students about the criminal law and notions of justice, I
Mm-hmm.
emphasize that justice is not the same as revenge.
Yes.
Justice is looking for individuals to be treated properly in accordance with what they've done. And if they've done
Mm-hmm.
something wrong, it's just to punish them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not society taking revenge. It's
Mm-hmm.
society trying to mete out, as we call it, justice. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what Joseph's doing, and your point is well taken, that he's looking for justice. He's looking for the right thing. He's looking
Yes.
for truth. And he's looking for his brothers. And once they have owned up to what they've done, once they have taken responsibility and demonstrated remorse for the wrongfulness of their conduct and appreciated just how they made him feel,
Mm-hmm.
at that point, there's no reason for Joseph to take revenge. As you said, justice has been served, and now they can continue
Yes.
and complete the reconciliation process, and there's no reason for Joseph to take revenge. Exactly right.
Yes. There is an observation here. If it was one of the other brothers, they probably would have reacted very differently when they saw their brothers again. Just because, of course, Joseph was different than the other brothers.
So
So,
maybe a more neurotypical response would be to take revenge, to say, well, you did that to me, you threw me in the pit, so guess what? Not, all is not forgiven. Maybe that's an interesting thought.
Yes. And Word also says, I have autism too. This is very interesting to listen to. And thank you for tuning in. Yes, it is a very fascinating book. I highly recommend everyone to read it. Again, it's was Yosef on the sorry, it's in mirror reflection. Was Yosef on the spectrum, understanding Joseph through Torah, Midrash, and classical Jewish sources. Can you tell us where the book is available? I know it's on Amazon. Any other places where our audience can buy your book?
Sure. So the publisher is Urim Publications, Urim. They're based in Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
and they
Yes.
have a website. So you can go on the Urim Publications website. You can find the book there.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, it's available on Amazon. And there are some brick and mortar stores, I guess, which are pretty rare these days, but I think more so in Israel, in Jerusalem itself.
Mm-hmm.
There are still many brick and mortar stores dedicated to Judaica
Mm-hmm.
and different neighborhoods in the United States and around the world as well.
Yes.
And they sometimes carry the book.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Any final words that you would like to add that I didn't ask you about regarding Joseph, regarding your book? Um, I'm going to order for Christmas. Wonderful. I highly recommend it. It's a great read. There are a lot of resources quoted in under each page where you can see more information about the context and the insight. It's truly fascinating.
Thank you so much. And I do want to thank that last commenter
Hmm.
because when I wrote this book, I was hoping that it would be valuable for different audiences.
Hmm.
I think in large part, I was hoping that, as we call it, neurotypical audiences
Hmm.
would read the book and appreciate the perspective of individuals on the autism spectrum,
Hmm.
appreciate through the story. And stories can be very valuable, stories can be effective ways of conveying ideas. I tried to
Right.
balance, I have those footnotes, but I also tried to balance the kind of scholarly footnotes and analytical process with the narrative of the story itself, which is so compelling. Um, I'm also very appreciative, and it's very meaningful to me when individuals on the autism spectrum read the book and provide feedback and find it
Yes.
meaningful for them as well.
Yes, absolutely. And like I said, when I read your book, I read it twice because some parts were like so deep. I had to go back to the text, and then I was reading your annotations and the references, going back and forth. And then I went back to the Bible, and I was like, wow, I cannot unsee it. I just see it so clearly. It's like the missing parts. It's like the perfect picture of Joseph going through his life. It was an easy life, and then a little bit earlier about Jacob, how he got to have Joseph, and more insight why his brother resented him so much. And it's just so wonderful. Thank you so much for writing this book and giving us an opportunity to look at individuals on the autism spectrum in a different light, in a more positive light, and see the great value they bring to society, and they come with solutions that otherwise neurotypical people may not have had. uh, it's wonderful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you.
Well, any final thoughts or questions to our audience? um,
So if you'd like to contact me, I'm always, interested in discussing further. I continue
mhm.
to study the story, and I've had very helpful and interesting conversations and very thoughtful insights from many readers,
Mhm.
um, offering ideas and suggestions of things I hadn't seen, I hadn't mentioned, and I studied fairly extensively, expansively in different sources. But I appreciate continuing the conversation.
Yes, well, people are appreciate your book, and thank you for writing this. So yes, I can agree more. It was a great read. I recommend this book to everyone, not just people on the spectrum, but also neurotypical who may not understand autism per se, and also to anyone who loves to dive deep in the Bible and Torah or any scripture. This is just a wonderful study. It's a great study, and it gives you a different perspective to look at biblical character of Joseph in a different light.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Professor, and I hope we can have another conversation if we get more questions, just a follow up. But I think we covered quite a bit of your book, and there is a lot more to cover. That's why I send our listeners, our audience, to read the book. And then, of course, you've done a lot of podcasts and interviews in the past as well. So I recommend searching your name, going to your website, going to your university site as well, and just getting all those links and opening them, listening to them, and just getting even a bigger picture of what we discussed.
Thank you. And if your viewers would like to contact me, you can find my contact information at the Touro Law Center website. So again, Touro, Touro. You can also find information about me on LinkedIn and on Facebook, and those are always convenient ways to connect. And some of those presentations that you had mentioned, the interviews, are posted on social media, on LinkedIn,
Okay.
on YouTube, on Facebook. So if your viewers are interested, again, in continuing the conversation, and maybe you and I will have a chance to have a further discussion. I'm sure
Yes.
there are many questions. I have many more as well. I'm sure
Yes.
you do, and I'm sure your readers and viewers will too. And as I mentioned at the outset, these are ideas that kind of jump out at you. These are certainly questions that have been asked for thousands of years. And I'd like to suggest that the basic premise that we can understand the story through the lens of autism is likewise not something entirely new. And when I suggest that point, when I raise the possibility, and it's only a possibility, just one more caveat, I suppose we should mention it, and it's in the opening footnote in my book. I think it's self-explanatory, is that we're not diagnosing a figure from thousands of years ago,
Absolutely.
but we are noting the same way we read Shakespeare or we read Homer, and we experience characters, and we can understand their personalities, we can understand characteristics, we can see a lot about them. Well, Joseph is pretty thoroughly discussed. These are snapshots of his life, but we see much about his life personally and professionally from the time he's 17 years old till the time that he passes away, over 100 years old.
Yes.
And it jumps out at us. And I think these are understandings, these are ways to read the story that we can better both appreciate the story on its own terms and also, importantly, learn these lessons and implement these lessons in a way that benefits contemporary society.
Absolutely. No, and I am really looking forward to more your. I hope that you will write more books, especially as you came across another interesting character in the Bible, in the Torah, and perhaps write another book. I'm sure it will be as wonderful as this one. And it's just, you gave me so much new perspective to look at Joseph in the Bible and the other characters as well. Like you mentioned Baker, and put yourself in his shoes when he needs to go to Pharaoh and just, hey, there is this guy, the dreamer, who was accused of pursuing Potiphar's wife. And just he interpreted my dream, so can you set him free? He was there, by accident, wrongly accused. Oh no, that's 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 a new thing for me. So thank you for that point.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I hope we can have another conversation sometime soon after I see more comments. I'm sure more people will watch replay, and then whenever they post more comments or questions, I would like you to come back and just maybe answer them.
Thank you. I look forward to that.
Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.